All right, once you clear the room, you open the door. You go inside a new dark room where you hear drops of water. And at the back, you hear, welcome.
I want to.
No, well, actually, we're gonna stop here because that's a great cliffhanger.
But Chris, we've only been playing for 35 minutes.
Yeah, but I was kind of planning on stopping here because I don't have the rest plan, and it's a great cliffhanger, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but we all love a good cliffhanger. It leaves players wanting more and wanting to come back.
But a good cliffhanger is only as good as the pacing of your session. I'm Chris.
And I'm Matt.
Welcome to Roleplay Chat.
We're two game masters who just can't stop talking about role-playing games.
Yes, and today we talk about pacing and cliffhangers.
Yeah, it's definitely something that has been top of mind for me for quite some time, is to try to figure out what the best pacing is and how to achieve it. So that's going to be the first thing we talk about today. Actually, no, it's not. The first thing we're going to be talking about is kind of the building blocks of what we consider to be part of a session. And then from those definitions, which we'll touch on a little bit, we're going to talk about what we consider to be the optimal pacing for a game session.
Yeah, and after having talked about this optimal way to do it, we're going to talk about some mistakes that come up while we tried doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and how to avoid them.
Yeah, some of our strategies.
Yeah, and we're going to finish up with a list of different ways that we can bring the tension up, or at least bring the stakes up at the end of a game to achieve this cliffhanger effect.
Mm-hmm. So stick with us. I think it's going to be a kind of a neat conclusion to all of the conversation that we had. I think that sets the stage well for us here, Chris.
Yeah, Matt.
All right, let's role-play chat. All right, so just before we get into talking about pacing in more details, I think it's important for us to really lay the baseline of the different components Chris and I consider to be integral parts of a session, of a game for a tabletop role-playing game.
Yeah, kind of the building blocks of what makes up the full session. So we have things that are pretty obvious, like a combat encounter, where we roll initiative and we go into turn-to-turn encounter.
There's also the social side to that. So you can have social encounters where you're trying to convince someone of something, interrogate someone, use rapport or diplomacy to get information or to convince them to do something for you.
There's exploration, whenever you're in a room and you want to know, like, okay, how can I find the entrance to the secret room, or even explore a dungeon where you're between encounters, and maybe that's a good time to ramp up the tension in the story.
Then there's also kind of the opposite of that. You've got your downtime. You've got things that may be more like upkeep, maybe shopping around in the city, managing your base, your resources.
Yeah, and sometimes even traveling could be considered downtime, depending on how it's handled. So anything that's more there to link the story to the next without necessarily having a rise in the tension.
And I think that's most of it. Did we skip anything?
Well, it could be cut in more detail and everything, but that's the main block we're going to use today to talk about pacing.
And then for sure, if this is something that you guys want more explanations on, we'd be happy to dive deeper into each of those things. I think we could probably have a roleplay chat episode on each of these things on their own. But let's now skip ahead to pacing and how we use these different elements in a game. And something that actually, Chris, I've been wondering for quite some time, and I don't think I have the answer yet, but what is the perfect pacing of a game? And I think we might have similar but also diverging opinions on this. So I'll let you...
Sure. For me, I've been thinking about this a little bit, and obviously it's not something I always get to do. Like, I don't always have the opportunity to do it right. But I think if I would have to say one best case scenario would be, I like to start high. So something with a lot of tension, basically a cliffhanger from the game before. Not necessarily a combat encounter. It could be a really fun social encounter, because I feel like my players, when we start, they're fresh. they're happy to be there. They want to get in the action. And if we start by downtime, shopping, or even intrigue where you have to like explore and find clues, I feel like the momentum is lost from the beginning. So I like the idea of starting strong, social encounter, something interesting, and then because it can't be up all the time, then I feel like it should go down. Let's say a 3-hour game, first hour of high, then the second hour of dealing with the aftermath of what happened, and then it should, I think, ramp up again and finish high so that it could start high the next game again, right? So I would say beginning high, then a little bit lower, and then.
And when you say, so you say high, the beginning is going to be, like you said, a social encounter or combat or something with high tension. What would you consider to be something of low?
Something of low would be like, let's say you've just killed the last orc and you're in a room and you wanted to go there to find the parchment that incriminates someone. Then you're in a room, you don't know where the parchment is. You have to go through the dungeon or the mansion or whatever location you're at and actually search, maybe do a bit of sneaking, but something that's maybe not engaging to everybody, something that maybe one player sneaks ahead. And it's still, there can still be tension, but people, not everybody is engaged. That could be one way to see it, as like not as engaging, or it could be just like you need to talk to people. A bit games that are sandbox are usually like that, when the players don't necessarily know what's the next step, but they have to figure it out. I don't like starting with people discussing what's the next step, because they're not, they just sat down. Their mind is not there yet. But if we start high level of energy, then after that they're more prone to have a good discussion about what's the next part of the plan.
Cool.
So yeah, that would be my idea. And just to be clear, combat for me is maybe once every 2 game I like. So in the high there, maybe out of the 4, I would like to see 1 combat. Once in a while, I'll have basically a full session that's combat, but that's you have to pace it in the whole campaign.
And I think it's important to note here for you guys listening, Chris's combat tends to be pretty high stakes. I don't think there's been that many combat situations in your games where it's been we're just killing goblins for no purpose. Like, it's usually pretty high stakes, and I think this is where it fits into your high tension, because if we screw this up, we lose the ancient artifact, or someone gets killed, or hostage is gone. I don't know. I'm just like, these aren't actual examples from anything, but I'm just well, okay, that to me resonates a little bit with me, Chris, because I have the same kind of idea of this high, low, high.
Okay.
By no means do I get to do that every time.
No.
It's a lot harder to do it every time, and maybe we'll touch on that, on how we get to do that later. But for me, the perfect game also has this kind of higher stakes situation. It slows a bit down into a more investigation, talking to NPCs, trying to figure out what happens next, and then at the end, it's gonna usually spike with a piece of information that gets given to the players. For me, I like to use the pacing. I like to use the information of the main story arc as kind of my barometer for pacing, or maybe not barometer, but for my resource for pacing.
Okay.
Usually, if I'm giving out something, like an event happens that's really telling of who the main bad guy is, for instance, that to me is like, oh, that's a great spot to just give them a fast one at the end of the game, and they're like, oh, we're gonna figure it out next time.
Yeah.
So it kind of hooks the players into the story, gets them more engaged in what's going on. But I echo your sentiment of this upward tension at the very beginning, because everyone's engaged, everyone's there, they're ready, and actually I find that players tend to be more interested in playing in the first 50% of the game.
Yeah, for sure.
It's kind of strange.
Like the players bring the energy in the first half, but I feel like the GM brings the energy in the second half, where he or she needs to basically bring the players to keep them in the story.
And I mean, a really funny example of this happened a couple of weeks ago when we were playing in my Rising Tide campaign. that you guys will get to see it at some point, hopefully. But I made the mistake of saying, like, okay, you guys are having breakfast at the bar. And then you guys come up with all these cool, like, I'm going to go play darts. I'm going to go talk to this guy. And I'm like, oh, cool. I'm gonna let you do it.
It was supposed to be downtown. Well, no, this was supposed to be the lower, and we made it like...
And you, like, did all kinds of engaging things. And I was like, well, you guys want to, so I'm not going to stop you from doing it. But I wasn't planning for this to happen. Which I probably should have been, because it's a realization that I've come to notice that people get really interested in engaging with everything and being active at the beginning. So more the reason to have a situation where there's actual cool stuff for them to engage with at the beginning.
Yeah, I feel like one of the big mistakes I made at the beginning when I started GMing was trying to make it like a story, like we learn at school, where it's like introduction and then something happens and then climax and then denouement and conclusion, and it goes like this. But at the beginning, well, maybe the first game you kind of have... Well, we talked about how to run a first game, and it was basically a way to go around that. But I feel like this doesn't quite work for games for the reason we're talking about. And it's a common mistake to finish where everything is like a nice bow, resolved.
Yeah.
But that makes it hard to start the next game.
I don't know how many times I ended a game saying, like, wow, this is a perfect lull. Let's end here.
Yeah.
And now looking back, I cringe. I'm like, why would I say that? You don't want to end in a lull. No one's going to know what to do when you come back next time.
Exactly. And I think the players won't think about the game between the games, where if you finish with a high, it's like, oh, what was that about? What was that thing? And I think that's where cliffhangers are great, even more than in TV shows. Like in TV show, it's the same idea, but in TV show, they control the pacing. When you start back and you sit back and watch a movie, it doesn't really matter that it starts high. I feel like it's not as important as in the game because of this momentum you need to deal with.
So we gave a few little situations where we maybe made mistakes when we were trying to deal with pacing, talking about maybe not ending on the right high note. Are there other things that we've done, Chris, that we can share that maybe were mistakes that we've learned from regarding pacing?
Yeah, I think something we both of us experienced is the fact that sometimes players, like we mentioned, the game master is in control of the pacing, but sometimes the players will not agree or will not go with the pacing you're trying to set. And sometimes it creates kind of a tension between the two. Like, so, for example, if you're trying to get to a certain point in the story, and then the players just want to chat, like you mentioned a bit about at the beginning of your game, and I think the game before that also it happened. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Or?
Yeah, and I think it was the second game in the session.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And
so the second game in the campaign, and in the first game, I thought it worked perfectly. I started you guys off. There was drama. There was high stakes. You guys went into an exploration phase where you're going through town, talking to people, learning about the setting and the kind of what's to come. And then it ended again with, the potential for combat and then a surprise.
Yeah.
That set you guys up for next time. But then what ended up happening was in the second game, I started it off with combat because I said, we didn't really have any combat last time, and I owe it to my players to be able to use their cool powers. So I threw that in, and right out of the gate, combat took too long. And that was on me. I had far too many NPCs running around, far too many bad guys. I kind of wanted to make it appear like this epic battle where there was a lot happening. But because of that, it kind of flipped over, and instead of being very engaging, it seemed just tedious, I think.
Well, I think what happened also is not only a lot of NPC, it was the first time you were using that system.
Yeah.
And for a game master to use a system for the first time with a lot of people, a lot of individual, like a lot of creatures, if you want, in the combat, it was hard for, like, you had to roll and roll and roll and roll. I think right now you might speed them up by rolling both at the same times or whatever you want to do in terms of mechanics. I think you were kind of not used to that system.
Yeah, I almost, like, looking back on it, would have used combat in this situation as a learning opportunity, as a downtime. a small, silly little combat that didn't really mean anything, that might have given some tidbits of information, but would have been more of a slower paced situation with lower stakes. In this situation, I wanted it to be high stakes. So I put it at the beginning. I had all this stuff go on. Even a couple of people died in this combat. But because it was just so bogged down, I was like, okay, I owe it to everyone to start speeding it up again. Let's go back to the pacing I want. And that was an even bigger mistake because I was forcing the pacing. The players, had I given them the opportunity to mourn the death of this person, I'm sure they would have taken it. But here I am being like, okay, let's get going. Like, I made the captain of the ship try to urge everyone, like, we got to go, we got to hurry up because time is pressing, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, I think I hit it well enough that I was trying to push the story along.
Yeah, because there's a time factor in the story also. But I think it was like some people were like, okay, we're going to do like some kind of funeral for that crewmate and take the time. And you were basically saying like, well, good, that's done, let's move on. Like the story, like it happened in the story, but we didn't experience it. So basically I think you did the high, low, high, but because the first part took so long, you had to basically reduce the middle or lose the end. And I think you basically lost the end.
I did lose the end. I basically, well, I still think I got you guys to a point that was interesting, but it wasn't the end that I totally planned. It was a plan B end that ended up happening. But honestly, going back, I would have preferred to lose my perfect pacing to trying to have forced it in this situation, because the players, although they still said that they had fun,
and we did for sure.
I
could see it in your face. You were frustrated, but with yourself, you were like, something didn't feel wrong. And to your credit, you thought about it. We discussed it a little bit, and you came up like the next game, total different way of running the game. Whenever you would feel that we would basically pull on the rope, we'd be like, okay, let's slow down. We're interested in that thing, like the dart example or any situation. You'd be like, okay, they're having fun. I'm okay with slowing down. And that's the problem with keeping that nice reverse bell curve is, well, you can't. If the players are having fun in the downtime, you might want to spend 2 hours there, well, downtown, like low stakes, right? And then you're finished low. Well, that's fine.
And that's okay. If everyone had a good time, including yourself, I think there's no problem in doing that. It's really just then becomes a struggle to reintroduce the reverse bell curve, because now you're ending in lower stakes situation. Now let's try to get it back up. It's tricky.
Another mistake I think that I identified a bit too late in my campaign was, I hope it's a common mistake, but I suspect it is, but it's finishing too late or too early. For me, it was finishing too late. So what would happen is we would reach, 11:30 midnight, and some people have kids, waking them up at
all hours of the
night. We're not all on the same schedule. So I would basically, we would reach 11:30, let's say, and I'd be like, to reach my high, give me 30 minutes. Give me 30 minutes. And then people would be maybe exploring or whatever. I'm like, and after 30 minutes, okay, I think I might need another 15 minutes. And by that time, player interest just goes. Normally if I have 5 players, 2 of them are still engaged. The 3 others are just going down, going through the motion. And now I wanted to finish on a high, but because of being too tired, they're on the low, right?
So there's also the opposite problem that you can have, Chris. You were mentioning always adding on a little bit extra, and it can feel like it's dragging on. The other side of that spectrum is ending too early. In our little intro where we have the 30-minute game because maybe the players sped through something, and you're like, oh, well, we're done.
Yeah, don't have anything else prepared or whatever.
That can be a big problem. I can't say I've experienced it.
Me neither. Well, 35 minutes is an exaggeration, but like, well, sometimes for me personally, I feel like the game could have used a little bit more. I don't think it happened in your game. It happened in a previous campaign, or sometimes with my brother. It like sometimes the game master is too tired, right?
Yeah.
It could be the case where the player is fine. So it could happen, but I've never felt like it was extreme. I feel like people are there to play. It's rare that we go too early, but it might be one of your problems. I'd love to hear if some of you have that problem, because it's so opposite to what I'm going through that it'd be very interesting to see.
It's almost like, I want to say, not like, to me, I can't really picture it that much as a problem, because if your players are ending a 2.5 hour night to saying, "Oh man, I wish I was playing more," I don't want to say it's good, because you want to give the players what they want, but you want them to come back next time wanting to play.
Yeah.
And I always want to play, but I'm sure that's not always the case for everybody.
I'm guessing it might also be linked to how many times a month you play.
Yeah.
Like what the amount of time? Yeah, exactly. The frequency. Thank you. Of the game. If it's every week, maybe half an hour too early, or even an hour too early because of life reason or even story reason, is not that bad, because you're going to play next week.
Yeah.
But if you play every 2 months, then
having an hour and a half game might be. Yeah.
Well, it might be enough for some people, but it might leave you with a bad taste in your mouth. Another thing is maybe not linked to that too late thing, but something I think we need to be cognizant of. Is that the right word?
Cognizant of?
Anyway, should be careful with is over cliffhanging, basically. It's like when you put a cliffhanger, you know that some TV shows, like cheesy TV shows do that, where they put like a big cliffhanger and then it turns out in the next game that it's nothing.
Oh yeah.
Like doing a thing where like you hear maybe like little like, and you're like, everybody's like, oh my god, it's Skavens, and it turns out it's like one rat in the next game, and you're like, oh well, that's so like cliffhanging just to do cliffhangers is not that great, I think.
No, yeah.
You have to make sure there's something to back it up after.
I think, Chris, we're talking a lot about how we've learned from these experiences.
Yeah.
Maybe we can actually give some other tips, and I don't want to say tips and tricks, because that's not what this channel is about. But things that we've had success doing, like to achieve this nice bell curve.
Sure.
Or reverse bell curve. What are some of the things that you've done?
I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but I think interrupts are great.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you have 3 hours, I say 3 hours. We usually play for more than that, but I like the rule of 3. So let's say we have 3 parts to your game. Whenever I feel like it's taking too long, the players are taking too long in the downtime or low stakes, then that's where I kick in an interrupt and it goes back up. At the same time, another thing would be the enemies are fleeing. I think that's a common. It's not hard to use. It's basically combat is taking too long.
Yeah.
If they killed the main guy, or now they've gone through enough enemies that the rest just flee away. We don't need to finish it. We could say they flee, or we could just say you basically kill all of them because it's a non-issue.
Yeah. I don't really like combat very much. So I have all these silly little ways of making combat, and sometimes I haven't actually had the chance to use them, so I don't know if I want to spoil them. I will anyway.
Yeah, you should.
One that I really like doing is having bad guys like turn on each other, where they like start to kill off the other bad guys, and they're like, "I'm good," or like, "Please don't like give me mercy, I helped you," or like stupid things like that. It could be fun.
They backstab the guy on the floor, and they're like, "See, I'm on your side."
Yeah, or even like you have one of them grab another one and like have him by the throat and be like, "I'll kill him if you let me free," or like they use their own players as like hostage.
Have you tried the other way, like having a hostage of one of the players? That could like stop.
That'd be cool. I haven't thought of that. Yeah, like they grapple onto a player and they like hold them on and say.
And then everybody like just like freezes and like, could you drop your weapon or whatever?
Yeah, so things like that, or have another monster come and kill off most of them on weird little things like this could end combat quickly.
Yeah, that's a good idea actually. If you're in a high, like at the end of an encounter, you have a combat encounter at the end of a session, and there's a lot of little monster, you could actually have a big monster come up, have them flee or be killed or whatever. But instead of continuing the combat, just stopping there, and that's the cliffhanger of next time we're going to start in combat again, but it's going to be a different one, the big monster. That could be interesting.
Yeah, so it's kind of like ways to make combat serve you as a game master, because I've had that problem. Almost it gets exaggerated in my head, where like if combat is more than 40 minutes for me, I'm losing my mind. I'm like, whoa, I can't.
Yeah, I think you're one of the players and game master I've seen that's the most like, okay, I'm done with combat. I'm done with combat. Let's just. We talked a lot about combat. Do you have anything for outside of combat pacing that you use?
Yeah, well, so obviously you have something that I found very, very good in Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition is their introduction of the skill challenge. I think it was one of the first, at least one of the first editions of Dungeons and Dragons to have this. And I love skill challenges. To me, it's a really cool way of having kind of high stakes, like everyone's engaged because there's a big storm and you got to deal with the storm, or you're climbing a cliff face and someone's rope is getting loose and they're falling and you got to, like, everyone's kind of has to do a little something at the same time. And at the very in my beginnings as a game master, I would have skill challenges be turn-based.
Okay.
I would make they'd have this epic moment where someone's like, they're rock climbing with all the ropes and stuff, and then someone's falling off, and I'd stop and make everyone say what they're doing one by one.
Okay.
And I found that actually ruined it. Like it didn't have the natural gut knee-jerk reaction of like, oh my god, he's falling, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. Everyone's shouting out for what they're doing.
Yeah.
And to me, that accentuated the pacing to be more high stake. Even though the stakes are obvious, if everyone's freaking out about what's happening, everyone pumps each other up.
Yeah. I think that's great, and we did it in your first game of your campaign, where after the game I asked you, basically in that situation, why didn't you do turn-based? And I think you were right. It really helps us being more in the moment and using your gut. But I think the downside to that, and it didn't happen in your game because the players were all pretty good with it.
Yeah.
But if you have players that are louder, or people that don't want to interact, without being said, now it's your turn. If you're fighting for the spotlight, basically, if you have a spotlight,
someone hogging it,
thank you, then that might be a problem. But that depends on your table. So something like I mentioned, the interrupt, something I do sometimes to control the pacing out of combat is the let's say I feel like they're done or it's slowing down. I would bring another NPC. It's basically a social interrupt, but there's no mission necessarily tied to it. It could be in the example of the Blood and Betrayal, when they were talking to Father Morton. Father Morton was starting to investigate, and maybe the players don't know that in my head, there's nothing more to be done here.
Yeah, we think maybe, it's a cool room, lots of artifacts. This guy seems to know what he's talking about. Let's stay here and talk to him forever.
Yeah, and whenever I see that, I'm like, oh, let's move on. Well, I had a militia or guard guy come to them and be like, oh, the captain wants to talk to you, and basically come up with a reason why the captain wants to talk to you. And the reason in the Blood and Betrayal was oh, you met elves before on the road. He wants to have intel on this.
Yeah, so it was really just it was moving from one social thing to another social thing, but their purposes were different, and this little segue kind of broke it up, which I thought was
really and I think a good way to do this, at least I made sure to do it. The guards are not escorting them. They're not saying you leave with us. Otherwise, it's really you don't have a decision. It's railroad. It's whenever you have time. Yes, it's in a hurry. He wants to talk to you pretty quick, but that way, if someone is about to do something in the room, they can still do it and then leave after. But sometimes I feel like the players are almost relieved to be well, I didn't know what to do. Now we have an objective. Even if it's not, I make sure I'm not restraining their decision. I'm just giving them a possible direction.
And having timing actually be a factor in it, I find helps, right? If an NPC says, oh, there's this thing that I need help doing, I've only got 2 days to do it. The players kind of clue in usually that like, oh, this is time sensitive. Whereas me going to the library to look at books about dark magic, in theory, I can do that whenever I want, or I can do that in my downtime.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So before we go into our conclusion, I think we owe it to ourselves and to you guys to kind of talk about how we raise the stakes and how we make tension and how we really end our games on a cliffhanger, so that you can inspire yourself from this list.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things that comes to mind when we talk about, we have a list here, is when we talk about raising the stakes, bringing up the tension, and then ending on a cliffhanger, is just to have danger. Have the players be in the presence of danger. They want to take action, but they can't end the game.
I think that's the most obvious way, is just have basically combat, or the ceiling is falling down and you're gonna have to like escape the temple or whatever, and it's just like you want the players to want to continue but stop before they are, I don't want to say bored, but they're done with the action.
And so that's kind of the main theme in most of these, really. So we have dangerous situation, dangerous monster. It also doesn't have to be the players that are in danger. It could be an NPC that they really care about now finds themselves in a situation where they're in danger, and then you stop. Yeah,
if we take the example of the guy with the knife on the throat, it could be like you're in the middle of combat and you kind of want to be done. You could be like, he grabs the brother of the player and he's like, I'm gonna kill him, and drop your weapons. And people don't know how to act. You stop there. Next time they're like, what the hell are we gonna do?
Yeah.
And that's a good way to, and we in our list we also have like building tension, and I think that's good when you finish with danger like that. Like, let's say tension could be built in that situation with the knife and everything, but it could also be built using a lot of description. If they move into a room, a bit like I did at the intro, where it's like, oh, it's really a gloomy place. You hear drops, you hear someone talk, and it's really creepy, and something comes out of the shadow, and that's when you end. Like, you build tension, you do a little bit, you don't stop with just description. Well, at least I try not to stop with just description, because otherwise it's a bit dry. You want to have something happen.
Some kind of event grabs them, interacts with the play. You hear a click in the floor.
Oh, that's good, actually. Just stops. But then, like we said, I guess you have to back it up with something. If it's just like, it was just a click.
Yeah,
then
it's gotta be something.
Yeah.
What else we got? There's also, presenting the players with some kind of decision that they have to take that's maybe conflicting. You find themselves interacting with an NPC. It's a social interaction, and you want to end the game because it's getting too late. Maybe that NPC says, well, I'm going to help you if you do this other thing that goes against your moral compass or the party's objectives. And now they find themselves in this kind of like moral dilemma where they don't know what to do. You can end there.
Yeah, and that also gives breathing room for the player to think about it during the games, because if he's rushed or she's rushed to make a decision on the spot, maybe we'll regret the decision or something like that. It's a great way to build tension, have a cliffhanger, and have the player make the optimal in terms of, for their character, at least the decision they're going to be happy with.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the following game. Another thing is to give information right before you stop. So information that changes maybe what the players were expecting. We're expecting to go one way, and they find a letter that tells them that the people they thought was the bad guy is actually trying to help them the whole time. And maybe like, oh, that has repercussion on everything they did. So they might need time again to think about it. And also it's great for them because they want to get to the next step of the story, and that's a great place to stop.
Yeah, and then you can also do kind of the same thing with your intrigue. So if you have the players going on this investigation, or they're doing something and they have a certain expectation of the outcome, and then you change the intrigue, or you bring up a question or information that blows their mind, and they're like, whoa, this wasn't the trail we thought we were following. End there. So the intrigue and the story element now got driven forward, but they can't take an action yet. They have to wait till next time.
And I feel like sometimes when you do it right, what I find myself is the player will say like, "Oh no, let's just do this next step," and that's when, as a game master, you have to be like, "No," and that's the thing. Like, it's the timing of, have we been playing for? We said we would play for 3 hours. It's been 3 hours. Good. We should stop here while it's on a high, and not basically do what they tell you to do. What they actually want to. Like that's what's better for them is to just stop here.
For now. We'll get back to it.
Obviously, there's a lot of different ways to do it. This is some of them. It's about building tension or building the story so that when you get to the end, it's interesting and the people want to come back for more.
That was a pretty neat conversation there, Chris.
Yeah, very interesting. Talk about like cliffhangers and pacing. So to sum it up, we started talking about the building blocks, the different social, combat, exploration, downtime that makes up all games, in our opinion.
Yeah, for the most part. And then we kind of described our optimal way of pacing a session, which is to have a high tension moment, scale it a little bit down, and then bring it right back up to raise the stakes and have a cliffhanger, and try to do that every time. So really have this reverse bell curve formation of tension, I guess, or of engagement in the session. And then we talked about some of our mistakes. It can be a mistake to force this pacing onto your players. If they seem to be having fun in a lower stakes environment and they're spending a lot of time engaging with people there, we've learned that it's better to leave them there. Don't force the story forward. You'll just end up with a bad taste in your mouth.
Another mistake we talked about was the fact that sometimes pushing to finish on a certain point, because that's what, as a game master, let's say I had in mind, was a mistake that I did, and now I have to learn to finish on a high note before the players asked to be done, like before the player are getting bored with the game.
Yeah, or it can be a mistake to also continuously add time on to the end to try to achieve the end you hoped to get. Instead, you have to really work with what the players are doing, and if you can't meet that perfect reverse bell curve, that's okay.
Yeah. And we finished with a list of different ways to achieve this high stakes cliffhanger effect at the end.
It was really, it kind of all boiled down to presenting a situation to your players that makes them want to interact with or make a decision or engage with whatever it is. And then before they get the chance to do that, you stop it. So I think that sums up pretty well what we talked about today, Chris.
That's all, man.
Let's call it a chat.